follow along and add folks in as we get new people. And as always, I will record this and then you could certainly consult it later. So the focus today is on creating community in your online courses, as well as I think everybody on board here is teaching a class, but if anyone joins us from student services or other areas on campus, this is an opportunity to really think about connecting the entirety of campus. So not just what we're doing in our classrooms, but also talking about counseling, talking about efforts with the high school. We have some virtual efforts coming up in the next couple weeks, of course, including a virtual senior day. So we won't necessarily just talk about the classroom, but that can be a primary focus. If you ever want additional information, as I always say, go to, I've given you the website in group chat, ltccteachingandlearning.com, and then if you click on COVID-19, that will take you to all the current information. So I try to update this. I do have to update some of the trainings coming up, but anything we've done in the past, and a number of you were a part of these workshops. The latest one we did was on virtual student engagement throughout the class, and today's is creating community. And next week I have one on, I have to let Maxine back in here again. Next week I have one on student behavior. So tune in for that if in particular you are concerned about classroom discussions in your virtual class and those maybe getting out of hand. We'll talk about some strategies for dealing with some of those issues. So today, as I said, we'll talk about how to think about community, not just in our classroom settings, but across campus, and how we might focus on notions of community. If you look up community, it's pretty interesting now talking about this concept due to the fact that we're existing under COVID and we're adapting, not just in education, but we're adapting politically, we're adapting economically. We're seeing more and more discussion of how places might be opening up, what that's going to look like, and it could be fairly frightening just thinking about the medical consequences of some of the issues of reopening. But certainly we're talking about community in new ways. Part and parcel is because of the fact that we're using things like Zoom and Canvas and virtual technological approaches to deliver office hours, to deliver instruction and other services on campus. So some definitions of community focus on the idea of locality, and for me, it almost connotes or means it has a spatial component to it. I would make the argument today that what we're doing virtually also is a space. It's a different kind of space. But if you look at other more recent definitions of community as the concept evolved over the years in terms of the meaning, we get into things like the relations of feelings that people share, things that people have in common, maybe sharing something or having some enjoyment in common. And very often, I think you can go onto virtual spaces now, Facebook, many other spaces, video spaces of social media, and people do share a lot of things in common. There's been an effort on Facebook recently for people to share views from their window. And so it's one way of trying to deal with the lack of being able to maybe go outside and socialize with people as we used to in the past. And so community has a lot of different definitions. As we're talking about it today, I think we do have to think of it. I'm going to try to let someone back in here. I do think we have to think about it in terms of moving ideas of community into these more virtual senses just because of what we're dealing with. I posted this, and I know JD had this on his Twitter feed, so I stole it from his Twitter feed, an article about Brown University and the president making an argument about why universities need to reopen by fall. And if you go on right now, I know there are maps and updates of who's open for fall, full-fledged, in-person, dorms open, everything, versus other schools like ours where we're doing mostly EVE or virtual teaching and maybe some limited labs based on what happens at the state and federal level and based on safety concerns. So if we can do some labs at the college that would involve people social distancing and really cleaning down surfaces and all that kind of stuff, that's a possibility. I always say if you have questions about that, I received a question from one of my social science instructors. And if you do have questions, reach out to your deans and ask them about that. And if you have concerns one way or the other, the default will probably be most of our classes will be EVE, including through the summer. As some of you know, involved in ISSE. ISSE will be primarily virtual this summer, really fully virtual this summer. So I mention this because I think in seeing articles like this, there is an argument being made that universities are going to, in some ways, and colleges as well, fail in some of their missions, delivering those to their students. We'll talk about that a little bit with that reading that I sent out, where if we're keeping things primarily virtual, we still need to think about some ways to create what that author said in that PDF I sent out, are the spaces between classes, extracurricular activities. And it's good to see some of you on board, including JD, who are involved with Student Senate, because we're certainly concerned about having opportunities to extend learning, extracurricular contexts, socializing of students beyond our classroom spaces. So we realize we're existing in very challenging political times, economic, medical, educational times. Just about every industry has been affected by the current conditions. I just wrote a short piece for a friend of mine who does an architecture journal, and we were grappling with this issue of how the tourism industries, how many spaces that have depended upon the idea of close proximity of people to one another maybe have to alter what they're doing. I mean, imagine what decisions need to go into reopening major sports stadiums, or even a university campus where you have dorms, you have cafeterias, theaters. All those spaces have been designed in the past for people coming together in large groups and not thinking about pandemics. Now, if you read some of the architectural literature, the Spanish flu of the teens many years ago certainly was an example of how some of our public spaces were transformed, but now we have to think about new transformations in our spaces. And so we're certainly doing that within education. And I want to give a shout out here. A couple of us were involved in quite a few discussions today about social science degrees and curriculum. And I want to give a bit of a shout out selfishly to my own discipline and JD's and others of you who may be teaching the social sciences at some point, that we really can look at these current times in some ways that we balance our perspectives. We shouldn't be totally optimistic nor totally pessimistic. We shouldn't say that technology allows us to do everything that we want to do, and we shouldn't, on the opposite, say technology doesn't allow us to do anything that is meaningful to our students. So a balanced perspective, I think that is honest, is important in these times. I know a lot of public leaders who are making the big decisions for educational institutions are constantly apologizing and saying, well, we wish we could be open in fall. But I think many of us realize that if there's a bigger medical concern out there that is affecting what we do, we're going to adapt as best as we can. And I think we have adapted in some amazing ways. If you turn on the news, there's a lot of focus on balancing the needs of people to work. I mean, the unemployment ranks have grown significantly. People who run, of course, educational institutions are concerned about the lack of opportunities there if we're only doing things virtually. So I think we realize there's a lot of adjustments, many adjustments that have to be made. I want to throw in a little bit of here of focus on the work of Durkheim, and Durkheim was a famous French sociologist, and I bring up his work today because he talked about the very important issue of how individuals are integrated in society. So in other words, are people connected to the fabric of society, or are they on the outskirts? And I think the issue is really relevant today when we think about expanding community beyond the classroom in our virtual senses. And so, unrelated to this topic, but important in a social sense, Durkheim wrote a book called Suicide. And he had a very close friend who committed suicide, and he wanted to look at some broader social reasons as to why someone whom he thought was very stable and emotionally together would commit suicide. And he began to discover that there are bigger social reasons behind something like suicide. And so what Durkheim, and I always stress this in my sociology classes, he shows us there's a delicate balance of someone being integrated in a society or not. And this is a chart that's been adapted from some of his work in suicide, and he defined 4 types of suicide, and then on both axes he talked about the idea of integration and regulation. So integration, again, would mean to what extent are you a part of social groups? It could be a spiritual group in your local community. It could be an animal rights group, a political group. Are you integrated high, or are you integrated very low? Likewise, on the other axis, you get regulation. So to what extent does a rulemaker in society, a police officer, define what your behavior should be like and bring you into line if you act up or something like that? Well, this particular chart has been pretty influential in sociology, and as I'll say today, I think it can really be brought to bear on some of the conversations we have about education. And I won't go through this, but after 9/11, there was a lot of interest in this idea of altruistic society. If you recall, the 9/11 terrorist attacks and terrorism in general, not in all cases. There are certain, the Olympic Park bomber actually would fall in not into the category of too much integration. But what's interesting about terrorist attacks with groups like Al Qaeda, Boko Haram, other groups like that out there is very often what happens is, people who study them say these are crazy people, and indeed we're not saying that they're normal for committing terrorist attacks. But the problem is not that they're loners or isolated individuals. The problem is they're too integrated into society. And what Durkheim would remind us of in a situation like that, because they believe so closely in a cause, in a situation, they're willing to give their lives for that. And not to get too political, but if you look at some of the articles about people who don't want to listen to medical professionals, about people who believe that COVID's a conspiracy and it's not harmful to us, that actually could be an example of someone being too integrated into particular social media groups or ideologies that maybe promote radical forms of thinking. So it's not, unrelated when we talk about some of these extreme behaviors. Now, to focus it more on education, we could think of a easier example here of an individual, a student, who is a part or not a part of your classroom focus, whatever that happens to be. So we've all had the situation, and some of you actually have emailed me. I know one of you in particular said, I had a student who for the last 3 weeks hasn't been doing anything. What happened with the student? And then there was a reaching out to student services. So that's an example of a student who has fallen out of touch with you, the instructor. That student is not participating in classroom discussions. And so in a sense, that student is not integrated into the fabric of your class. Again, that extreme, to take Durkheim's sense of the extremities of integration and how it's a delicate balance. You've had students, and I know I have, and I don't know about the rest of you, but I've had a student or two in the past who literally tries to take over a discussion board. They're a little unbalanced, and this is maybe a good topic for next week's focus. And as a result, they enjoy your class too much. They enjoy it so much that they're willing to post 10 times the number of discussion posts in your discussion board as the typical student. And because they're so integrated into your class and they love it so much, let's just say at times they need to be controlled or reminded that other students need to participate as well. So I think what that shows you is in a discussion board, it's a balance between students who do too much and are too well integrated and students who do very little and are not even in touch with you as an instructor. So it's one way to think about Durkheim's work in the context of a class. Now, applying this more to ideas of community and educational worlds, we can start to extend this focus of integration of our typical student outside of the classroom. And I've left some off the list here, but these are all the possibilities of how any student who walks through the door of LTCC, in the previous sense of physically walking through the college doors, one college drive, not in a virtual sense, they would, of course, encounter all of these various centers, the Child Development Center if they had children, involvement in student clubs, student government, taking part in various events and activities, hanging out in the equity office, getting some help with tutoring, going to the bookstore, the library. And, of course, every educational institution has different versions of all these offices or programs or events or contexts, but the idea is that somehow all of these together will allow students to have a fuller picture in terms of their educational journey, and we're changing some of this now as we speak with meta majors and guided pathways. But the key to looking at this and going to that article that we'll get to in a little bit, the author made the point that it's not just what's happening in the classroom. You have students who are involved in athletics. You have students who want to take part in virtual opportunities such as through the Coyote Corner app. So this is true, right? This was true months ago for most of winter quarter. Now that we've shifted to online, I think the conversation needs to be, and this is the purpose of that shared Google Doc we'll talk about later, can we still do some of these things in a virtual sense if we're forced to stay virtual for fall quarter and who knows beyond? We don't know what's happening in terms of vaccines and other efforts to slow the curve, as people have been saying with COVID. So the good news is, if you look at our Promise program, and if you're not familiar with Promise, Promise is our free tuition program that includes a free bus pass, book vouchers for students. There is a required class, and I happen to have developed the curriculum for this class. It's now being taught by other people and will be taught by a number of people next fall. And what's cool about the Promise program is we realize that we need to make more connections between what many of us do in the instructional side of the house at the college in terms of teaching our classes and the other touch points and connections and offices on campus. So the idea behind the class, our Promise cohort class, is that in the first quarter of your work at the college, you'll become familiar with work experience. You'll become familiar with tutoring. You'll learn about Student Senate. You'll learn about all these opportunities out there. And as we'll talk about later with branding theory, it really is creating what's called a touch point. So all these places on campus, if a student meets someone from the library and learns about library research opportunities, tutoring opportunities, the idea is they'll be more, again, to go back to Durkheim, integrated into the fabric, all the social networks and physical and even virtual spaces and contexts on campus. And so that's really what we're getting at in looking at some successes of the past, including Promise. Promise is a new program, but we feel like we've been moving along up until COVID, and we're still working with Promise, of course, and making efforts virtually. But we think we have some good foundations that we can build on. You also know right now, as we shift into a virtual space, we're trying to replicate some of the things that traditionally have done in a face-to-face context. Now, I think a conversation today is, what are some challenges to this? Are there some things we can't do? We cannot necessarily teach some of our EMT classes maybe in a virtual environment. So we either cancel those or think of a way to adapt. And so every educational institution of higher learning in the country, in the world, is talking about and having these kinds of conversations in the sense of how to, again, create community in virtual senses. So we have our virtual campus. We can still send out information on social media. We can be active in the Coyote Corner app. Those of you teaching classes, and I think everyone on board right now is currently teaching. I don't see anyone from student services. But we have opportunities out there in our classrooms to use virtual technologies like Labster Virtual Labs, real-time Zoom classes. We can use Zoom for office hours. We have Proctorio, we have NetTutor, multimedia apps, and so forth. So we're over time, and we've done this relatively quickly, developing more and more ways that we can call the kind of education that we're delivering to our students an opportunity to, if you will, replace what has traditionally been done in the face-to-face classroom. That being said, we all realize that's not perfect. I think students realize that and faculty realize that. And that's why the approach I take as a social scientist is to maybe be more upfront about some of those challenges such that we can work on them and not be embarrassed with the fact that we have, a Zoom class set up, but something happens to the technology and half your class can't log on or you can't log on. That kind of stuff is going to happen. So instead of being embarrassed about that, let's have some honest conversations about how to make things better. And at the same time, I would say, this is one of my Twitter posts, I believe, and I think, there's been work in the past, many of us who've taught DE, I've been teaching DE at the college since 2004, and for many of us who have been doing that, we've been saying for years, there's a lot of possibilities to do things in a virtual classroom that you can't do in a face-to-face classroom. The flexibility that gives to our students, the flexibility for students who are more introverts and are very shy and unable because of some issues with shyness or social anxieties, they can't participate in a face-to-face class as well as a virtual class. So this idea to say that as we talk about maybe virtual commencement, and the college has not made an announcement about whether we will hold one or not, but I think the idea to say that there is a reality to virtual spaces. It may not be the ideal space we want to teach or work in, but it's real at some level, so we have to have some conversations about what that means. For many of our students, it involves personalizing their spaces. It could be trying to adapt the space for these new times, add a whiteboard, and this is just straight off the Coyote Corner app. So I think on the one hand, it's great that students are doing this, but my question goes back to Durkheim's work. Is that particular student also then integrated into, in parentheses, the virtual fabric of campus? And that's really, I think, the focus. When you have seen the growth of industries like Peloton, which does virtual real-time activities on bikes, on exercise bikes. It's a great example of how you can leverage technology to do things in real time. Would you rather be in a spin class in your local gym? If that's the case, then you could do that. But for some people, it fits their lifestyle. It just, eliminates a commute and all that kind of stuff. So I think a lot of us have said, since we've started working in this virtual realm of teaching, we're maybe somewhat surprised at how well some of this has worked. I mentioned this in another workshop, but as you continue to teach your classes, as you begin to identify technology issues or technology concerns, connect with me, connect with Treva. I've had a conversation recently. I had a conversation recently with Al Frangione, who is involved in a lot of our technology issues, and I mentioned things like down here, Google virtual reality glasses and other technologies out there, including apps, that maybe would allow students even more connection to the discipline that we're teaching in, connection even to campus and some of our traditional physical spaces. So if you had a chance to look at this reading, and if you didn't, I can, it was sent out with the email, but I can certainly offline connect with you and send that out again. But it was a very short article, but I thought it was an interesting article talking about how community is the secret to successful fall enrollments. Are already thinking about what will happen in the fall with some of the universities and colleges making calls already. I think Purdue is saying they're fully in person. Other schools, including LTCC, have said that we're going to be primarily virtual. 2 points from the article that were probably key for me. One was this point here that figuring out the virtual versions of the spaces in between classes in the past. So if you had students in the past who took a class in one of your traditional classrooms, and they left your class, and then they went down to a student government meeting, and then they went to the bookstore, and then they went for tutoring. All those spaces on campus, we probably realize right now we haven't completely recreated in a virtual sense. So I think that's kind of the first point to talk about, is how could we do more of that if we're having to stick with virtual education and a virtual campus for a longer time. And then secondly, bringing in that student voice. And I'm looking at JD, who is our Student Senate advisor, and all the important work that our students do in terms of student government. We need to have the student voice. We need to have certainly the creativity of students like the one I showed you previously from the Kindly Corner app, who decorated her room, but we also need voices that are telling us, what are we missing? What are some opportunities out there to build on and create new virtual services? So the challenges and opportunities, as we get more here to the conversation part of the workshop today, as I said before, with Promise, we have opportunities there we can build on. Meta majors and guided pathways. We've been saying for at least a year now that we want to put more information up on our website about careers and opportunities in the meta majors. Well, now is a perfect opportunity, I think, to build some of that out virtually. And then community partnerships, advance, what's happening with dual enrollment, the University Center. We have to maybe re-envision what some of that looks like virtually, but we don't have to reinvent the wheel because we've been successful in some previous areas on campus. So to go back to an earlier point, when you look at a theory in the world of branding, often what folks talk about is how to create a full experience for the individual who wants to interact with their favorite brand. And so applying that to the educational environment, we could talk about, again, how to create those touch points on campus, but to do so in the virtual sense. Then as we transition back to a face-to-face campus, and certainly that will happen, we don't know when, as that happens, I think then we have some opportunities to continue to engage with our students who are not on campus, as well as our virtual instructors. I've been saying for some time, since I started in my new position, that I feel like we don't successfully reach out to our virtual instructors. And by virtual instructor, I mean someone who is currently teaching in New York State, somewhere on the East Coast maybe, and that person will never come to our campus. We should have opportunities for that individual as a faculty member to participate in workshops, in professional development activities, in onboarding if that person is a new instructor. So I think it's a great opportunity for us to do some of this virtually, both for our students as well as all our staff, which includes I would say virtually mostly are part-time instructors. I'm not aware of virtual staff, although there are a few people in technology and consultants who aren't local to us for some of our grants. But we typically try to pull those folks in by either on-campus visits or Zoom sessions even prior to COVID. So just think of how we might create those touch points on campus given the virtual nature of the times. Have a image here from Student Senate. So elections are currently going on. JD, do you want to say anything about not just because your picture here, but how all of you are working to do the student activities in a virtual sense, given COVID and what we're working with now?
Well, I can speak to both the Student Senate and also a little bit about Debate Club.
Sure.
The Student Senate, we're going through our election process, so we've had planning meetings and so forth with the officers, and then Danny Maslones is also a co-advisor, my colleague there. So we've had various planning meetings, and then we've been bringing various people into the fold, Shauna and Julie Booth, and we're going to be having a mixer where people can actually bring folks they know who are interested to a Zoom meeting next week. And I don't have my calendar in front of me. I don't want to walk away. It's over on the table. But we have various events to help make our election process more successful. Because what we do know is a lot of people are not, they might know a bit about what's going on, but they don't necessarily want to run for office.
Yeah.
So we find that being able to connect with people, that's useful, and get them to come to our mixer. And then we're also going to have candidate forums and so forth, all hosted on Zoom. And then Debate Club is just continued as normal, just using Zoom. And so I'm typically the timer. Our last debate was a week ago, Tuesday, and the topic was gentrification, and we do the Lincoln Douglas style format, and we just managed to do that. And I've also had conversations with Sage Alexander about photography. We had a conversation on Zoom, speaking of this, talking to folks in between classes and everything. So I'm just finding other ways to chat, because I'm here at home by myself. I haven't hung out with anyone in 6 weeks, so I think I need a little bit of that social interaction too, right?
Yeah, for sure. So the nice thing about that, at least how you're describing, is by holding Debate Club virtually, you're not losing anything necessarily. You're not in the same physical space. It's a virtual space. The one asterisk there is probably, if you've been reading about Zoom fatigue, I've been posting on my social media feeds. Zoom fatigue is affecting people. A lot of us are feeling isolated. We sometimes go stir crazy. I haven't left the house today. I petted my cats. I had lunch, but I think there is that sense of we are just going a little bit crazy just doing Zoom. But again, it would be better to do that than to close completely. I've heard there was a stat today, some harrowing statistics. One was that they said nationwide, and I believe this was four-year schools. I think community colleges is going to be the reverse trend. Four-year schools, the stat I read today is they're predicting it could be close to 20% of students will be lost in the fall. Variety of reasons. Could be some students can't afford tuition, particularly if they feel like they're not getting, there's been this whole political economic debate about should universities where students are paying $70K a year refund tuition, dorm fees, all this kind of stuff. What about the cost of education if you're doing everything on a Zoom session? And then secondly would be students who don't want to do online. And I know some of my colleagues from classified staff I see on Facebook and I think there's a very important arguments posting things related to equity and lack of access and technological resources. So we can never assume that we're necessarily covering all our bases in terms of connecting with every student and that there aren't some gaps there. What I like hearing about your Debate Club example is there still is an opportunity. It's better than canceling it altogether and not doing it. Zoom is not perfect because of some of those fatigue issues, and I've been reading more and more just about eye strain and the lack of three-dimensional space where you can't always communicate in the same way that maybe you would if you were having Debate Club in that same physical space. But I like at least this acknowledgement that it's still allowing things to go on. Is it perfect? It's not, but that's better than completely closing down. So,
well, yeah, I would also add too. If you're getting to know various people, because I've been here, this is my second year, right? So I'm getting to know people in a variety of different contexts. And like I was saying, Sage and I share an interest in photography, so we had a conversation within the last couple of days. I forget which day it is. Every day starts to blend together, to be honest with you. But we had a good conversation about just techniques and using our cameras. And so I think that any and everybody could benefit from that. Just put it in there once in a while. Like if you know you share a similar interest in something, then just find a way to work it into your schedule. And I think that we're not commuting. Like I normally have a 38-minute commute. So I certainly have a little more time then for these conversations.
Yeah. Yeah, interject humor or other tidbits into a meeting or into a class discussion. It certainly wouldn't hurt. So, Elizabeth, did you want to jump in?
Oh well, I'm planning the virtual senior day.
Oh, good.
So one of my primary interests was just jumping on here to see other inspirational ideas and things that people are doing, and really, as I explained it in the instruction office meeting the other day, and I'm going to send an all staff kind of email probably explaining how it's going to go, but I feel like what I'm trying to do is preserve some of the feelings and some of the ritual behind the that it's a milestone, that it's a transition students are doing towards college, and get them excited and whatever. But it's unrealistic to think that it's going to be, similar or replace the other event. So I made this analogy, and I know it sounds super dopey, but I asked people if they like veggie burgers, because it's like if you like veggie burgers, you probably just appreciate it as its own thing, not as like, oh, it mimics meat perfectly. Then you'll just be disappointed. And so I tried to explain that I think, it'll be a very different format kind of event with its own pros and cons. But it hopefully will engage students, and in certain ways, it'll be easier to connect with them.
Yeah.
Because I'll be able to do things over time. Everything will be recorded so that they can hear it again and review it. So I guess, I'm in the preliminary planning stages of that, and trying to kind of assess, like my advanced organizer for the planning meeting I had the other day was like, if anyone had any particularly good memories from prior events that kind of I could extract the feelings from and try to mimic. And then also whether or not anyone had been to like a virtual conference or a big virtual meeting and had seen anything particularly unique or innovative done that they were like, that's great. That's really interesting or participatory, because I could, steal those ideas as well.
That's great. I love your point about not seeing the two in competition with one another, because I think we often do that where we say, well, in a traditional class, it would be this way if we were, in the physical classroom space. And I think that's really important because they really are different. I think, there are things I could point to even prior to COVID that I like better about teaching in a DE environment in terms of a class. And then the reverse. There are things I like better in a face-to-face class. ISP as well. And maybe we're not talking about ISP as much now, but we certainly should, be reaching out to those students and our staff working on ISP. With our incarcerated students, it's a whole different form of teaching. And again, I don't think we shouldn't get into, well, it's easier or better to teach a face-to-face version than an ISP. We don't have that opportunity. We can't always go into a correctional institution. I mean, some of that could change over time. We might roll out more virtual technology to work with our incarcerated students, but I think it's the same kind of thing where we have to acknowledge the difference and try to do the best we can within that mode, instead of getting into this like there's a real and there's a virtual, and the virtual is somehow not real. And I think that's just like really important for us as a conversation, and then maybe that eases a little bit that anxiety we have. And we all have anxiety. Students have anxieties as well. Some are better at virtual classes than others. So I wanted to mention, I put in the chat here, and I will try to send this more widely across campus, but if you wanted to participate in this, I thought as we're working through this, it could be now, it could be later certainly, we could look at this spreadsheet. And what I put on here was the idea that we could, maybe list a particular concept. As an example, we could do the virtual, senior day. It's already happening. But that's an example of something where, in the past we've done it traditionally face-to-face. We've had campus tours. We've had swag, different prizes that students get. But how can we do that virtually? And as Elizabeth is getting at here, you can do that and maybe have that asterisk that says, it's going to be different than the traditional, or should we even call that traditional, than the way we used to do it in the past. What are some of those differences? And in some cases, there could be budgetary implications of some of the concerns we have maybe about our classrooms. If you want to do some new things in the future with technology, if there's a software needed, if there's some kind of physical computer tool you need to deliver the virtual education, that could have some budgetary implications. And I don't think we've yet defined what's happening with that process of trying to maybe get some of this technology out. So so I love that we're doing virtual senior day. If we do virtual graduation, I know a concept is maybe students could record short clips and to go to some of the stuff we talked about earlier with just personalizing a class, or that student who personalized her desk space at home. You could imagine, maybe with some edits and some censorship, right, potentially, but you could imagine some really cool short videos that people could produce that could be part of some different virtual graduation that we might do. I'm not saying we'll do it. I don't know when the decision will be made, but there are some opportunities to rethink how we traditionally focus on graduation. Let's be honest, we've all been to a graduation, just like we've all been to a committee meeting where we were not 100% engaged in that graduation. I remember my undergraduate graduation from Indiana University, and we had a famous speaker, but it was like 100 degrees in southern Indiana. And we were just looking at our watches and asking, when are we going to get out of here? We were proud, but at the same time, there was that sense of obligation, of ritual in a ceremony, and not in the sense that Elizabeth talks about ritual. More ritual like we're doing this because it's required of us or it's highly encouraged of us. So it's not like the real versions of some of these things have always been perfect either, and that's a good realization for us to think about. Doing some things virtually that maybe would actually make it even more enjoyable. I don't know, just an idea. So and we don't have to focus on the spreadsheet, but as you're hearing some of these concepts, again, we talked about some classroom stuff, and then we also talked about connecting the classroom to events and student senate and all the stuff that goes on with dual enrollment and the high school and our community partners. And so where do you come in terms of this conversation about creating virtual community, and what are some ideas you have either for classroom or office context on campus, in the virtual sense on campus?
So yesterday in the instruction meeting, Michelle brought something up that I kind of liked. I guess a lot of events for welcoming students, include mock lectures. Mm-hmm. They get somebody to do a more exciting version of their lecture, maybe a little bit shorter, on from whatever meta major, and that's wonderful and all. But now, what she suggested is actually I could request professors to let students sit in on their real campus class. Mm. So rather than have, like a welcome day where somebody has a mock thing, mm-hmm. It's like, well, maybe you could just come and see what it's like to be a virtual student by just tuning into the course mm-hmm. as like a 1 or 2 day audit or something like that. I mean, if I could just add them on Canvas, they're all already in our system.
Oh, great. Okay.
And so that's kind of neat because that's an authentic experience that otherwise we'd be trying to recreate, mm-hmm. And instead they could see what that really looks like if they were interested.
I think that's a great example. We I mentioned earlier in the Promise class where we tried to introduce there. It's more connections to services, but we've talked about expanding the Promise class to include what you're talking about, mini lectures, or maybe JD would come in and talk about note-taking skills. Some of that stuff that Julie Booth, our Promise director, calls it adulting, where in the Promise class, and sometimes it does feel like, the adults are talking to the younger people and saying, now you need to keep a calendar, and here's how you do that, or you need to learn how to balance a checkbook, or you need to learn how to use office hours effectively. But some of those skills are really effective, and I am very much focused. I love talking with Amber in our work experience office about giving students soft skills. And some of those soft skills could include things like here's how you interact with your instructors in your class. And a mini lecture or seeing that, some version of that in a Canvas class could be a virtual version of giving students a sense of what to expect at the college. Absolutely
You
love
really
that.
want me to talk about note-taking, Scott?
You've talked about it. I think you'd be a great person to talk about note taking.
Okay, I can also tell them what the underside of a bus feels like, so thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, no. I mean, but you have a reputation of being, how would I say it, strict. You expect things of your students, and I think that's great, because if a student transfers and they want to study poli-sci at any legitimate college I know of, they're going to have some level of ability of reading a book and critical thinking skills and analyzing and writing and note taking. And again, it's a lot of the stuff we have created in the Promise class, and that's why I say let's leverage successful programs they're kind of nascent, they're beginning to grow and blossom. So again, what we've done with Promise, dual enrollment, Advance, University Center, we can take some of those efforts and adapt them to the virtual environment. And then, as I said, with meta majors, we can have the virtual space up and running and going in a really professional manner, even if when we reopen as a physical face-to-face campus. So it's actually kind of a benefit to do some of this now, because then we've covered those students and, as I said, those faculty and even some of those staff like consultants who do not ever physically step foot in 96150 and in our college space, and they are off somewhere else virtually. So I'm actually someone who has been saying for a while we need a virtual footprint, because we're not fully involving our part-time faculty who are never going to step foot on campus. But yeah, JD, I think it'd be great for you to talk about note taking. So maybe a mini lecture, talk about whatever concept you want to talk about with our students. I think in the past, senior day, we've done a lot of cool stuff with like campus tours. So it'd be interesting to think about what that would look like virtually if we have that ability. I'm not sure, but we do have the app, right, that has the walkthrough, the campus walkthrough. So we actually could use that app that we had prior to COVID. So
we do have the app. They can download that. But what I think about is like, okay, what's the purpose of doing an in-person tour? And what are the interactions that you have? And what are the feelings that you have? And some of those things, I'm like, okay, how do we replicate that in a virtual world? I mean, not exactly the same, but the feeling, right? I want to preserve the feelings. The same when I try to brainstorm graduation. It's like, people have a handshake. That's a ritualistic, important piece. How do we replicate that somehow so that they get the same feeling without having it? And so I was thinking about like virtual visits, and one of the benefits to this technology is I was starting to learn about Zoom breakouts. Does anyone here use those? No? Oh, you do? Good. I was thinking, okay, so I'll have a student panel, right? Whereas normally you would get a chance to ask questions of students in person, but maybe you don't get a chance usually to speak with them privately. But if you're on a tour, you might be like, as you're walking, you're privately catching up with the student who's leading your tour, the ambassador, and you're asking them questions about the experience. I could create Zoom breakouts where I break people out and they have their own private spaces with 2 or 3 other students and a student ambassador, so that they don't have to listen to or be in front of the facilitator asking their questions. And in a way, that's pretty cool. There's a lot of things that could be replicated with Zoom breakouts, and we've just touched the tip of the iceberg with that, because most of us don't really know how to use them.
Yeah.
Elizabeth, I want to say something to that too. Another thing is you can make people co-hosts. So while you're the host, you can make some of the ambassadors or someone a co-host so that they can join the meeting, or the students can be in the meetings themselves talking. But there's a mechanism that if a student has a question, they can contact the instructor or co-host and ask them to join their meeting or join their breakout. Sorry. And I just wanted to say, Scott, we're doing Zoom for ESL classes, and we're even having success with our beginning level students with 0 English. And so we're In fact, our enrollment is up slightly from what it was in the winter quarter, which we're kind of stunned by.
And so the teaching environment, do you find that it's been effective? The learning's been effective?
Yes, we do find it's been effective. I'm just in the process right now that we've had several weeks of communicating more directly with the instructor. We're more in depth with the instructors, but so far what we've been seeing is, yes, there are limitations to it, but some of the students really like doing the Zoom because they feel that, they don't have to come home from work, take a shower, eat dinner, get ready, go to campus, come back from campus. They find that it's easier, especially if they have home issues like babysitting or other issues. But we are finding that students are learning and students are moving forward, and they are attending class. So 4 weeks into the quarter, we do see that we are having successes. So I think as we keep going on, it's going to we keep learning how to better do it, because I let everybody know that next year, this is it. We're on Zoom all of next year. So we'll have a little bit more time to plan things better and do more creative work using the Zoom platform. But it's, again, has limitations, but it seems to be working for us.
Yeah, I love just the idea that, to build on our successes, because we get better at Zoom, we get better at Canvas, and we're going to be pros at that. And then if it's 2021, when we go back, I'm a little concerned about the projections from the, epidemiology folks about winter and what could happen, kind of like with the flu, with an increase in number of cases. Who knows? Vaccines and all that kind of stuff. But it's important to remember, because again, it may not be our favorite location to teach in a virtual sense, but we can up our game and get better at it, and then over time, we're going to be really great at that, and we might discover some access issues out there. Or I heard from some of the science folks, they like Labster so much that some have said they may do some, even if we reopen fully 100% face-to-face as normal, they might experiment for access purposes for students who cannot attend locally to take a chemistry class. They might experiment with a virtual Labster-driven class, which I think is a kind of a cool discovery from this whole experience, which hasn't always been pleasant for us in terms of adapting to a pandemic. Yeah.
Can I just share something very fast? Yeah. So this is back making a comment about teaching students to take notes and teaching students how to adult. Mm-hmm. So I actually had something like that for my remedial math class that I was teaching. It's a prerequisite class for statistics, so it's specifically meant to be a help class. And there was a little unit where it was an official homework assignment where they had to take a little quiz afterwards, after watching a video, to learn what are office hours, what are student services that I could reach out to, or like how to study for an exam. So of course that was not the bulk of the class. The bulk of the class was still about math, but there still was like a few assignments dedicated to that. And they weren't worth very many points. They were relatively short, but that's always something that can happen even in a classroom setting.
Yeah. No, absolutely great point. And again, over time, maybe we'll develop some of this out. I'm thinking of our big CVC OEI grant, $500,000 grant, which is extended now through December 31st of the fall quarter. And it's primarily focused on career and technical education classes. But I could imagine that some of the resources coming out of that might allow us to develop templates or preset services or lessons of this sort, teaching students study skills or teaching students through a Promise program how to interact with the professors and how to be prepared for a class. Because if we do more of that up front, if we can get students to look at the stuff and, as you said, assign some minimal points for a reward, like with a syllabus quiz that many of us have done in the past, maybe that increases student success and retention by 1% or something like that. And that's always the name of the game, whether we're doing virtual ISP or face-to-face instruction. So I think that stuff, as much as we have time, it's a challenge to get through all our material, but if we can insert some of that, it's a great opportunity, I think, to hopefully focus on positive forms of student success up front in a class. So other thoughts or ideas you have about, going back to earlier, we talked about how to virtually, if I can find the chart here, how to virtually recreate senses of community. We're doing a lot of this as we speak, certainly tutoring, counseling, a lot of these I'm looking at. CDC is closed. I know they'll be reopening. They have done some limited teaching of classes for kids and parents and so forth. Student clubs, as JD mentioned, debate club, it seems pretty seamless. I worry a little bit about the events. I'm glad, Elizabeth, that you're focused on this and others, because JD and I were both working on a meta major event. There was a Frida Kahlo event. Those literally were canceled right there with the start of COVID. So I think we're maybe losing a little bit with our meta majors. So hopefully, if we are doing this for a long period of time, at least through the end of fall next year, we can talk about how to take some of the successes and challenges of senior day and maybe apply those to doing some kind of virtual meta major event, because we had 2 planned and we were excited, and I'm worried a little bit that the air out of the balloon came out a little bit just because of having to shut down the campus. But I think a lot of these we're continuing to do. We have to talk about maybe areas of need. We have to talk about equity and technology gaps. I've heard that the Wi-Fi hotspot issues, I was in a meeting this morning. I think Elizabeth and some others were in there as well. We're still maybe a little challenged with getting some of that technology running perfectly. But some of you know, up at the lake, there are the occasional cell phone issues to be had, and things of that nature, cable issues, technology issues. So, but any other thoughts on others on this list that maybe we could expand, or challenges in some of these areas that we've identified?
I feel like for some of these, it's allowed to have like a one-on-one type of appointment. Like, let's say you need to ask someone a question, and it will just be a Zoom conversation between you and a staff member, like from the student perspective. And I feel like students, of course, are creating more community, so kind of having group discussions. The discussions can be about anything. Of course, some of the clubs on campus, I'm sure, will host their own discussions based on the topics that the club is about, but I still feel like other services could host some kind of meetings where it's not just like a one-on-one type of like service-based thing where it's like an event, but like not a super formal event, like a semi-formal kind of just discussion where people just pop in and out, but like there's a chance for students to speak and be heard, but also listen to others and participate.
Yeah.
So just kind of replicate that social interaction.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, again, as the article was getting at, creating the space between classes. What students used to do before when they get out of their poli-sci class and they walk over to the bookstore or whatever. If we can do at least some of that virtually, then we have a greater chance of long-term retention. Again, the stat I gave on four-year colleges, universities losing 20%. I think community colleges, and maybe there's some variation by geography and other variables out there, but I think we have seen that our enrollments are just as strong in the past. There are certain disciplines that have suffered, but there are others that have always been really strong. For social sciences, we've been doing a very strong DE presence. So for us, getting our classes up and running, other than adding maybe that Zoom component, I don't think too many social science faculty have added Proctorio, but it wasn't as big of a hurdle. Whereas for some of our lab science faculty, it was a big deal. Or our math faculty trying to deal with calculator issues and proctoring. So again, as we get better at this over time, we can continue to build out services and hopefully add in things that we've missed in the past, or areas where we've identified through our student voices on campus and our student leadership of areas where we need growth and expansion of services or new services. Anything else that's jumping out that maybe is a future conversation about virtual community?
Like slightly unrelated, but you said that the grant that was this really cool grant for online stuff that LTCC had for this particular school year is getting extended for another 6 months?
Yes, exactly.
To end in June, July, but now it's until December, right?
Yeah, exactly. So the state made a decision, and there are, I would say, close to 70 institutions that received this grant last year. And we were lucky, along with those other schools, to have this extended because it just gives us more time to finish up on things. But the truth is, many of the things we're doing, I think, will add even more as successful points of completion or project completion points, because so much of what we're doing is all virtual now. So it's going to allow us really to have more included in our successes on the grant. But I'm really hopeful that as we build out more with the Instructors Academy and a student guide for Canvas, and some of that was created prior to COVID, that will again give us opportunities in the future to offer really excellent quality DE instruction. And then maybe we'll discover we have to go back to our traditional bread and butter face-to-face classes and ISP and talk about how to up our games there in terms of instructional quality. So yeah, we're now going through December 31st for that grant. So it's kind of good news for us. Okay, so
And sorry, I missed the first part of it. So I didn't get to experience the wealth of the conversation about these chance interactions, right? The hallway interactions.
Yeah.
I was thinking about these the other day, and it's one of the things I miss the most about work in person. You know, you run into somebody and then, you, I don't know, chat for a little bit and you learn things and you have these exchanges. Does anyone here have you heard of chat roulette? Has anyone heard of it?
Yeah.
Okay, it was this thing that you used to be able to sign on to. It was awful.
Yeah.
It was this middle school thing. And you could sign on and they would randomly connect you to somebody across the world or anywhere, somebody else who was on chat roulette. And so you never know, you ended up in somebody else's living room and you had these conversations. Now, of course, this was global and it wasn't really organized in a particular way. So you might come upon some stuff you probably shouldn't see.
Yeah. Offensive stuff. Yeah.
However, I was thinking about the concept and I was like, wouldn't it be cool if from a staff and faculty, and we could do this for student life too, if we had some way to reproduce that. And I don't know, instead of having just a happy hour, which is not like a happy hour because it's a whole bunch of people all looking at each other at the same time. Whereas if you had an actual happy hour and a bunch of people went to Sedelis, you would still only end up talking one-on-one, with somebody. You'd break off and you'd go and talk with somebody and then you'd, move across the room and go talk to somebody else. But if rather than scheduling happy hours even, or if occasionally we canceled happy hours and we had a kind of chat roulette where you could get on and get connected to somebody randomly that, somebody who else otherwise is in the LTCC community and wants to participate, it could be super interesting and cool. And in a way, it's kind of like those chance interactions that you would have in the hallway. Maybe you've met the person before, maybe you haven't. And you could have some, I don't know, conversation starters, or a friend of mine used to call them emergency questions, just like random inquiries that give you some insight about the people. But this is a kind of like networking activity I could imagine people doing that might be one of the bigger benefits of this platform, because you could interact with people you otherwise would never have and learn things, So I don't know. I was just thinking about that.
I think that's cool. I put that on the list. I remember chat roulette, and again, you'd have to. I guess if it was just campus only, you could filter out all the weird stuff, and inappropriate stuff. But that could be really cool, actually, like a little mixer to have people get together and just chat about whatever's going on. And I try to do that, by the way, just a little plug for Tuesdays as we close on our time here. Tuesdays, 12 to 1, do the teaching talks, and that's, unlike these, very unstructured. And I keep saying to people, hey, if you want to talk about, and I think there was one of those where we talked about groceries, where we were just frustrated with our groceries situation. And so really, come to the teaching talk. Anyone is welcome every Tuesday, 12 to 1. And, unstructured emotional support. It doesn't have to be about pedagogy or anything serious. It could be about how you're adapting to. I read an article recently about the behavior of our pets, how our pets are acting stranger because we're home with them all the time. And so I've been going around with my wife saying, there's a reason our cat is always diving under your yoga mat. It's because of our cat's anxiety about being home with us more often. And she said, I made a stretch there in terms of the data, but I don't know. I thought it was a possibility. So So maybe on that note, we'll end it. Thank you all for participating. As usual, I will have a video available, and then you could catch the first part of this if you missed the first part. Next week, same time, same place, virtually. Student behavior, come with all your questions or concerns. If you have any, high maintenance or challenging students in your classes, or even if you don't, come with your questions or ideas. So, and that is it. So I bid you farewell to our virtual community for today, and have a great rest of your evening, and talk to you all real soon. So, okay, take care, everyone.